would be one of the great understatements of history. But for those of us who had the privilege of being in her presence, she was delightful, full of joy and compassion for everyone she met. She bravely fought cancer for years, and as Mike wrote on Facebook a few days ago, this morning Mom won her battle with death, and now light perpetual shines upon her. We send our thoughts and prayers to her family, particularly her husband John, her daughter Sherry, and of course Mike, Sarah, Lillian, and Chapman. But if Mike were here, he would tell you that no matter where you come from, no matter what you're dealing with, no matter where you are in your faith journey, you are welcome here. We are better because you are in the room. And actually, next week, we will be back in the room together. Next Sunday, March 7th, Ekklesia will go back to in-person meetings at Parkway Heights United Methodist Church at 5 p.m. We hope to see you there. Throughout Black History Month this February, we have had reflections from our own Sharon Miles regarding some heroes of Black history and the Civil Rights Movement. We've heard about Frederick Douglass, Medgar Evers, and Fannie Lou Hamer. And tonight, she shares some thoughts on the conclusion of Black History Month, while encouraging us not to cease the practice of learning Black history. So now, I'll turn it over to Sharon.
Hi, Ekklesia Hattiesburg. Sharon here, and I'm excited to bring you a different location. It's a gorgeous day outside, and I hope you got to spend some time outside in the fresh air. I've thoroughly enjoyed it today. So, today is the last day of Black History Month. And it also concludes our series that we've done for the entire month of February, where I come and I bring you a moment in Black history. So trying to decide who to talk to you about today, obviously, was a big deal. Should I talk to you about Ella Baker, who is known as the mother of the Civil Rights Movement? Or should I tell you about Amzie Moore? When I hear about stories about the NAACP in Mississippi, Dr. King, where did he stay when he came to Mississippi? Or even the involvement of SNCC, how SNCC ever became involved in our state. Amzie Moore's name comes up in all of those stories. Or should I tell you about Annie Devine or Victoria Jackson Gray, who was from Hattiesburg? There's so many stories and so many people. Well, the truth is, I could not decide. But the good thing is, I don't have to, and neither do you. Because Black history is to be celebrated, honored, and appreciated all year long. So this week, someone asked me, they said, Sharon, why does this mean so much to you? Like, why do you spend so much time thinking about history in the past? And the truth is, I'm going to answer that question for you today. The truth is, learning about my history, learning about our history has empowered me as a person. It's empowered me to walk a different way in the world, knowing that people fought and people cared enough to demand a better life for me, one that they may have never seen for themselves, but they were thinking about the future. They were thinking about future generations. But when I think about my parents, when they were children, they were a part of the sharecropping system. Now, they were like 9 and 10 years old, but they were picking cotton. And so that means that my grandparents were a part of that system too. But beyond economics, it was also a system that taught them that they were less than and to be afraid. And so the residuals of that still linger. You know what I'm saying? So in order for me to know myself, I need to know my history. I think that's true for all people. But also, in order for you to better understand people who don't look like you, who may walk a different path, Black people specifically, I think the more you know about the history of this country, the better it'll be for all of us. It'll help you connect more and understand more of those stories and the struggle that Black people have been through in this country. So I'm going to conclude this series simply by saying it's been a pleasure to talk with you about Black history. I do hope that you will dive into it and look at the artists. The artists are the people who tell the truth about what was happening in the society. Look up Sam Cooke. Look up Nina Simone. Look up Lady Day or Billie Holiday. Like look up these musicians, these artists. Look up these people. And the more you understand about the past, you genuinely will have a better interpretation of how to walk in the present. So happy Black History Month. I look forward to learning more stories, and I hope that we'll continue to learn together.
Thank you, Sharon. Throughout the month of February, we have turned our eyes and ears toward those stories of heroes about Black history, and particularly the history of the African American church. Mike has challenged us to approach the gospel from that history and hear the gospel anew from the perspective of many who were oppressed and looked down upon by their own supposed Christian brothers and sisters. This history is the rest of the story and a new journey for so many of us. Mike talked about what it was like for people that came from faith traditions that so many of us grew up in, to be both so sincere but also very wrong at the same time, similar to Saul. Saul was devout, but Saul was actually very destructive. That changed when Saul was met by the light and heard the voice of God on the Damascus road saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" It's at that moment that Saul knows the rest of the story, because he is confronted by the fact that God's full identification is with the very people that Saul was making to suffer. Saul had to be disrupted and disturbed to hear from God himself that he was with those who were being harmed. The truth is, God was and is with the poor and the oppressed. The whole story mattered then, and it matters now that we hear the story from the voices who were often victimized by that history, again, from the hands of their own supposed Christian brothers and sisters. Mike then reflected on the perspective of Mary, being in a place where the good news was actually good news here and now, that God is with those who are forgotten, and God is with those who are at the bottom of the ladder. Because hearing the rest of the story doesn't just disturb the comfortable in Saul's case, it also comforts the disturbed, as in Mary's situation. And then last week, Mike talked about the need to understand what it actually means to hear and follow and practice Scripture and the teachings of Jesus, particularly from the perspective of the African American church during some very horrific events. This history isn't ancient history. This history happened in many of our lifetimes, in our lifetimes of our parents and grandparents. Because Mike said there's a real temptation to draw this distinction between believing in Jesus for the eternal destination of your soul and also to actually do the things that he says we should do. Mike drew parallels between the audience who must have heard Jesus over 2,000 years ago, Jewish people who were living under the daily life and rule of their Roman oppressors, and also the parallel to our brothers and sisters of color who experienced daily life at the hands of Jim Crow and discrimination and poverty. What does it mean to live that experience and then actually follow the teachings of Jesus in the here and now? For the African American church, actually following the teachings of Jesus at the present day took real conviction and a real daily decision to live contrary to how someone in that situation, in that position, might want to react. And so as we come to this last Sunday in February, I believe the question we as a faith community must ask ourselves is, where do we go from here? It's a question I asked myself last summer on the heels of George Floyd's murder and protests and calls for justice and even our state changing its flag. I found myself asking, where do we go from here? Where do I go from here? And how can we avoid this being a one-and-done season where we check the box that we had a few uncomfortable conversations and then move back to more or less the status quo? So where do we go from here? What do we do now? There have been many times in my life where I've come to some sort of crossroads, where life as I knew it had been disrupted, and attempting to make sense of something, given a new set of facts and circumstances, lent itself to a strong feeling of discomfort. And in those times, it was impossible to go back to how you once thought about things and approached and processed situations, at least if you're being honest with yourself. New evidence should change perspective and practice. Understandably, these sorts of crossroads are uncomfortable. Given a new set of facts, you can't go back as if your perspective wasn't somehow changed, but wondering what now can be an exercise whose next steps are not easy. And I remember a professor I had in college, Dr. Dick Conville, who listened to me one fall semester lament about some life situation that I didn't really know where life was leading me. I'd come back from a life-altering experience over the summer, and everything I thought about my future and what was important was now called into question. I couldn't ignore what had happened. But I made the comment to Dr. Conville that I didn't know what God's will was. And he asked me if I had ever read Micah 6:8, which of course was the The Southern Baptist in me knew by heart, by way of Bible drills growing up. And I said, yes, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. And he said, that's God's will. Simple, yet to me, it was incredibly profound in the moment, but certainly not easy. And so that experience came to mind this week when I was processing that scripture and reflecting on all that we had talked about, and Mike had talked about over the course of the past month. And I remember the very first sermon I ever heard Mike preach, which I believe was Mike's very first sermon as a minister in Hattiesburg some 17-ish years ago. I pride myself in being an amateur Mike Dixon sermon historian. But his first sermon was on that passage, Micah 6:8. And the full passage goes like this. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. But the point that evening by Mike, which slightly rattled me then and still makes me uncomfortable today, was this. Doing justice means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But what God is requiring of us is to do God's idea of justice, do God's version of justice. And when we consider over this month that we have wrestled with coming to grips with the rest of the story from the perspective of the African American church, the idea of doing God's version of justice should cause a great deal of additional reflection. Quite frankly, it should make us uncomfortable. Saul had this reckoning of realizing that the justice he had been practicing was one entirely inconsistent with the God he wanted to serve. Mary saw God's idea of justice as good news. Scripture is covered in examples of God's idea of justice, if we will simply pay attention. The prodigal son, the Sermon on the Mount, the Samaritan who tends to the man who had been beaten and left for dead on the side of the road, the woman at the well. All of these point to a character and value system that is fundamentally at odds with our traditional ideas of what it means to do justice, which, growing in my faith tradition, simply meant do right in your personal behavior. But again, if we consider the idea that the idea of doing justice might call us to do more than simply avoid certain bad behaviors, as Jesus would do, and not just avoid the checklist of things that we were taught not to do, it does mean that God could be requiring more of us than we are simply acknowledging. In this context, I believe doing justice means we need to live in the constant recognition that the rest of the story is as important as the story that we grew up with and are prone to gravitate toward. Because acknowledging that there is a rest of the story that is equal to the parts of the story that we knew should humble us, and it should move us. Simple, but certainly not easy. First, it should mean that we actively seek to hear the rest of the story on a consistent basis. That means not only a collective effort to understand our history, but to listen to personal perspectives on how it has manifested itself in the lives of individual people, particularly those in our own lives. That starts with a willingness to have conversations. In his book, How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity, and the Journey Towards Racial Justice, Jemar Tisby points to the need to practically move ourselves and the church forward when it comes to a more just system. He writes this, fighting racism does not consist of a set of isolated actions that you take. Rather, these actions must flow from an entire disposition that is oriented toward racial justice. We have to reposition ourselves spiritually, emotionally, culturally, intellectually, and politically to address the myriad ways that racism manifests in the present day. Racial justice is a lifestyle, not an agenda item. He mentions several essential understandings necessary to make this shift, but often it simply begins with us continually putting ourselves in a position to have our present day worldviews challenged, especially if it makes us uncomfortable. In fact, I would say the most growth happens when continually existing in a state of discomfort. We should be more intentional about our practice of having continual dialogue, especially approaching that dialogue humbly and doing more listening than speaking. The whole idea behind Paul's words in Philippians, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. That scripture should guide how we approach these conversations. We should also do our part in doing research, if it's important to us, whether it's on the idea, the history of racial injustice, like this month, exploring the faith experiences, traditions, and practices and perspectives of the African American church. As Sharon mentioned, there should be no end to learning the voices, heroes, and icons that have shaped Black history and the civil rights movement. If we value the people in our own lives from different backgrounds, we should proactively seek to learn and to understand. Hearing the whole story matters, but hearing the rest of the story must then alter our perspective and our practice. When we don't know what to do, honestly seeking to do God's justice, God's type of justice, and then loving mercy and walking humbly with God, those might just be the next steps. We look forward to seeing you next week in person, 5 p.m. Parkway Heights United Methodist